Let's turn now to the first segment, which is Romans 14, Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food, oh my. And we're basically at the very end of Romans 14, verse 1, where we've been basically spending a lot of time talking about the identity of who are the weak in the faith. And as you can see on my screen right now, I've got this blue part highlighted. We're going to read that tonight. But let me just give you the overview of the two essential positions, answering the question, who are the weak in faith? In my post-production, I'll probably have a little slide that I put up that you can see this. But for those of you with my live class, just listen for a moment. I'll just recap. And I won't spend 10 minutes doing it. I'll actually do it in like maybe 2 minutes. But the basic understanding of this passage, when we ask the question, who are the weak in faith, I'm working from two generic sentiments or perspectives on this particular passage for this particular study. The traditional Christian sentiments are that, quote, the weak Christians are the weak in faith. The weak, in this passage, who are the weak in faith? The weak are Christians whose weakness is directly connected to their belief in Jesus plus a continued preference for keeping Torah, i.e., the weak are Christians, but their weakness is displayed in their continued preference for keeping ceremonial aspects of the Torah. Thus, primarily the weak are Messianic Jews in Paul's day. This is the traditional Christian sentiment. Primarily the weak are Messianic Jews, but it could just as easily include Gentile Christians in Paul's day who had gravitated into Israel and taken up an interest in the Torah of Israel and the scriptures of Israel and began to take on parts of Torah to the point that when Paul encounters them in his letter, he has to explain to them as Christians that they no longer need to be bound to those particular parts of Torah. That's all been done away with, set aside. They're no longer under the law, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so that's the traditional Christian sentiment that is held to by many in Christian circles. It's not held to by everyone, but it is a major position. It is, as I understand it, it is the favored position, the more popular view of understanding Romans 14 and who are the weak in faith. The alternate perspective per Mark Nanos that I've been working from, of course, Mark Nanos is not the sole author to hold this position, but he's simply the one that we've been borrowing his perspective since I've been working from the book, The Mystery of Romans. Mark Nanos purports that the weak are non-hostile, non-Christian Jews. So they're not Christians, but they're also not hostile, and they're non-Christian Jews whose weakness, if we want to call it that with air quotes, with quotes around it, weakness is directly connected not to Torah keeping, like the traditional Christian sentiment, but it's directly connected to their as of yet inability to believe in Jesus as Messiah. So their weak in faith is weak in faith in Jesus as Messiah. However, we need to carefully distinguish, as I've been working down through my commentary, that they have a strong faith or an established faith, not only in God, but in the reliability of keeping His commandments, and so thus what we could describe it as a loyalty to Torah. So they are traditional Jews. They have a monotheistic faith in God. They believe the reliability of the scriptures that they hold dear, that they study. So they have been taught from a child that God is the only God there is. So they have that monotheistic faith. And yet, they have now been studying through their scriptures, through their Tanakh, to ascertain who the identity of this one that would be sent from God, this Messiah, that would come and rescue Israel, not just from their oppressors, but also ultimately rescue the entire world and bring the world into right relationship with God. Who is this Messiah? Who is this anointed one that is talked about in the Tanakh? So they peered into their own scriptures and looked for this sent one. And along comes Jesus, and now we need to investigate. We need to kind of interview him. We need to kind of interrogate him. Is he the one? Is he the candidate? Or should we look for another, right? Remember the question of John the Baptist? Is he the one that we've been waiting for, or should we look for another, right? So that's what's going on. This is who I believe is a good alternate perspective to consider. I know many of you who are listening to my commentary, watching my videos, and reading through my studies are not going to be convinced right away. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. All I do is ask that you give this perspective a careful examination, and don't just dismiss it out of hand just because it doesn't sound like the one you've been taught year after year after year for many years. Oh no, of course the weak are not unbelieving Jews. That whoever taught about it. Don't dismiss it out of hand. All right, give it a serious read. So having said all that, that's the perspective that we've been working from. Let me read this last paragraph here. We won't spend too much time on the Romans 14 and 9. I need to spend more time on the Shema study because I've got a lot of technical stuff to get through. So it'll be really short for the Romans 14 tonight. So this last little paragraph will dead end us. We're in the conclusion part of verse 1 where Paul asked, in fact, let me first just read verse 1 real quick. I should have had this pulled up. I'll just scroll up here to the top so you can see. Sorry about that. All right. So verse 1 of Romans 14 said, who are the weak in faith? The question. And verse 1 says, as for the one who is weak in faith, right? Ton de astenunta, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. Te piste pras lambaneste me eis diakrises dialogismon. So this phrase of astenunta te piste, let's right there. This is the weak in faith, or weak, the weakened one, the weak in faith one. What does it mean to be weak in faith? And Paul doesn't say right up front that he's weak in faith in Jesus, but he also doesn't say that he's weak in faith because he keeps Torah. So we have to determine from context. And so that's the context that we've been working from. And as I mentioned in previous studies, just go back and listen. As I mentioned, it's more likely from the context that Paul's not talking about Messianic Jews because of the simple fact that, number one, Paul was a Messianic Jew, right? He didn't abandon his loyalty to Torah. Thus, why would Paul consider keeping Torah as a Christian a sign of weakness? That doesn't seem to fit theologically with Paul's own example and his lifestyle, nor does it fit in with the theological context of the multitude of prophetic passages that have God explaining to Israel that one day via his Spirit he would bring Israel to a right relationship with himself via his Son, via his Spirit, and in rescuing Israel from the inside out, right, giving her a new heart, putting his Spirit within them, writing his laws on their inward parts, right, in enacting the new covenant on a corporate level with Israel. This would result in Israel actually not abandoning Torah, but the opposite, actually becoming more Torah observant, more shomer mitzvot, more dati, more frum, like we would say in Yiddish. They would become more loyal to God's Torah and be able to actually walk it out in a way that was never before possible due to the deadness of sin that we talked about in the liturgy part about being under the law. So I don't find it contextually probable that Paul is referring to weak in faith as a reference to someone who's a Christian but yet still keeps Torah. Also, we found from the letter itself, there's internal evidence from Romans, the letter, as well as the rest of Paul's writings, that he's referring to people who are stumbling over the dual aspects of Jesus being the Christ to the Gentiles and to the whole world, right, to Jews as well, Jews and Gentiles, Jesus being the Messiah to Jews and Gentiles. That aspect, coupled with the fact that Gentiles are now brought into a right relationship with God, bypassing the long-standing proselyte conversion ceremony that was present in Paul's day. Those two facts are the stone of offense, the stumbling stone that the Jews just couldn't get over in the first century because of their blindness caused by their nationalism. To imagine that Jesus was the Messiah, both to Jews and Gentiles, and that Gentiles can be brought into the family of God without having to become Jews, those were barriers to Jewish theology in Paul's day. And thus, they stumbled over that theology. Read about that earlier in Paul's letter here. That forms the context for the stumbling of Israel to be equated with the weak in faith here in Romans 14. So let's read this paragraph real quick. Being a longtime student of Tim Hegg myself, I can see that Yashanet, Hegg, and Curtis that we looked at earlier were obviously influenced by Mark Nanos. In the end, after putting all of the data on the table to work from, and that I believe is a safe way to approach it, don't form your conclusion without giving yourself the benefit of the scientific research. Give yourself the opportunity, if you can, use the internet, use books, use Torah teachers, use preachers, use people who are able to navigate through the original languages and things like that. give yourself the benefit of research and background research before you come to a conclusion that, oh no, of course, the weak can't be unbelieving Jews. I believe that Nano's view allows for the best reading of the context of the rest of the passage, which is one of genuine Christ-empowered servitude. So this is really the meat of Paul's admonition here in Romans. Whether we agree or not on the identity of the weak being Christians who are still keeping Torah, or unbelieving Jews who have faith in God and loyalty to Torah, but they haven't yet decided that Jesus is the Messiah. Whether we decide on what their identity is as the weak, what we can agree on both sides is that Paul is letting us know that, and let me read it here. Romans 14:13 reads, quote, "Therefore let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or a hindrance in the way of a brother." This is the central theme of Paul's message here, particularly in this part of his letter in Romans 14. We had Jews and Gentiles quarreling over differences of opinions on certain parts of Torah, whether it was for Jews or Gentiles, whether it was for believer or unbeliever. We could massage all of those issues. But something that Paul definitely didn't want happening between the two groups was the judgment of one toward another. So in the end, even by today's standards, whether we have Christians, Gentile Christians who say, we don't have to keep Torah because it's no longer for us and we're not under the law. Paul teaches us that the law has been relaxed in Jesus. It's been fulfilled by Messiah, etc., etc. It's a dispensation we're in a different dispensation. If that's your perspective, it still doesn't give you, a Gentile Christian, the license, the freedom to judge another Christian who believes that they should be keeping the Torah. And when we flip that argument over onto the other side, we Messianic Jews who honestly and genuinely and sincerely feel that we've been convinced that the Torah is still relevant for us, right? We read through passages after passage after passage in support of a Torah-keeping lifestyle, Hebraic lifestyle, but yet we still can't convince our friends and family members to get on board with the view that we hold to. Nevertheless, we're not in a position where we can judge them for not keeping Torah or not following the parts of Torah that we feel are important, right? Hey, you guys don't keep Sabbath, you're still keeping Sunday. Hey, you guys are still eating pork. Hey, you guys are still keeping Christmas. What's wrong with you? Are you dumb? Are you stupid? Okay, we cannot have a judgmental attitude towards them as well. This is really what Paul's trying to get across to us. So we've got to work our differences out between one another, but one thing that's not allowed, judgment. So let's keep reading. So I go on to say that all the while retaining a picture of Paul who himself was both a Christian. So the view that we're working from is that Paul was a Messianic Jew. He was loyal to God. He was loyal to the Torah. He was faithful to his people, Israel, but at the same time, he was a believer in Messiah. He had embraced Yeshua. His eyes had been opened by the Spirit, and he was not turning back on that. So he was one of the strong. Like I say in my commentary, he was one of the strong. He was definitely not one of the weak. We do want to emulate Paul, whatever his position was. We want to emulate that. We want to imitate him, right? He even tells us so, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So he was a Christian, i.e. one of the strong, as well as, are you ready for this? He was a lifelong Torah submissive Jew, i.e. he was one who could readily appreciate Torah-based lifestyle choices of the weak. So no matter how we define the weak, if they're weak Christians who are keeping Torah, or they're simply unbelieving Jews whose weakness is a weakness for believing that Jesus is the Messiah. Either way, the common element is that both of these people groups are still preferring to keep Torah. And so would Paul frown on someone wanting to keep Torah? Well, as long as it wasn't done for the wrong reasons, like out of legalism or out of nationalism, or simply for the fact that it's the routine heritage religion of my people, then he would want you to keep Torah. I firmly believe, as I'm reading through Paul's letters, that he was a champion of keeping Torah, and he would encourage Jews and Gentiles in Messiah to take on a Torah-observant lifestyle. But the difficulties in Paul's day was the nationalism that blinded Jewish people from seeing how Gentiles were brought into this relationship with God without having to change their ethnicity. And because of that ethnocentric Jewish exclusivistic blindness that existed in the first century, that caused teachers such as Paul to have to take parts of Torah and to push back on them, such as physical circumcision, to kind of set them in their context away from and against covenant membership in Israel and covenant membership in God's people group, and what it means to be a saved individual and things like that. So Paul is not discouraging Torah observance in his letters. He's discouraging legalism. He's discouraging misguided nationalism. He's discouraging ethnocentric Jewish exclusivism and things like that. But he doesn't really have anything bad to say about keeping the Torah. And we're going to find that out as we continue to look down through this passage. Next week, we'll turn to verse 2 through 4. What is the contrast between anything and vegetables? And we'll read down to the verse. And if you notice where it says notes, there are none. Why? Because I want to make this more just kind of unplugged fashion. That's why it's called Romans 14 Unplugged. So there aren't any notes there, so that we can just kind of make our notes up as we go. Unless I feel led to put something in there. But so far I haven't been led to put anything in there. So we'll see what happens next week, okay? All right.